This photograph was taken in 1980. 2 years later, all four of these women would be dead, murdered in rituals so twisted that even seasoned detectives couldn't speak about them without breaking down. For 30 years, their killer walked free, hiding behind holy robes and sacred vows. But when the truth finally came out, it would reveal a network of evil so vast and so carefully hidden within the church itself that it would shake the faith of an entire nation. This is the story of how four innocent servants of God became victims of the most sinister religious cult ever discovered. On a cold winter morning in 1978, four nuns vanished without a trace from the quiet village of Saint Helena. Their beds were empty, their doors unlocked, and their lives seemingly erased overnight. What happened next would haunt this small community for over 30 years, until a determined priest would uncover a truth so dark it would shake the very foundations of their faith. Sister Margaret, Sister Catherine, Sister Anne, and Sister Rose had called the Saint Helena convent home for nearly a decade. These women had dedicated their lives to serving God and helping the poor families in their rural community. Every morning at 5:30, they would gather for morning prayers in the small chapel attached to their modest stone building. By 6:15, they would be in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the local children who came to their daily feeding program. The village of Saint Helena sat nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling green hills. With only 300 residents, everyone knew everyone else's business. The nuns were beloved figures who brought hope to a place where jobs were scarce and winter months could be harsh. Sister Margaret, the eldest at 52, had silver hair that peeked out from beneath her habit. She ran the convent with gentle authority and was known for her warm smile that could comfort even the most troubled souls. Sister Catherine was 38 and served as the convent's teacher. Every weekday, she would walk the dusty path to the village school where she taught reading and writing to children whose parents had never learned these skills themselves. Her patience seemed endless, and she had a special gift for making even the most difficult lessons feel like games. The children adored her, often following her home like a parade of ducklings. Sister Anne, 29, was the convent's healer. She had studied medicine before taking her vows and used her knowledge to help villagers who could not afford to travel to the nearest hospital, which was over 50 miles away. Her small medical room in the convent was always stocked with herbs, bandages, and basic medicines. She had delivered dozens of babies and helped countless families through illness and injury. Sister Rose was the youngest at 24. She had joined the convent just 3 years earlier, bringing with her a beautiful singing voice that filled the chapel during evening prayers. She worked in the convent garden, growing vegetables that fed both the nuns and many hungry families in the village. Her hands were always dirty from soil, but her heart was pure gold. The four women lived simply but happily. They owned almost nothing beyond their habits, prayer books, and the few tools needed for their work. Their days followed a peaceful rhythm of prayer, service, and community. They ate their meals together, sharing stories about their day and planning how to help families in need. After evening prayers, they would often sit by the fireplace, mending clothes or preparing lessons for the next day. On February 14th, 1978, everything changed. That Tuesday morning, the church bells rang at 5:30 as they had every day for years. But inside the convent, silence greeted the dawn. No footsteps echoed in the hallways. No voices rose in morning prayer. The kitchen remained cold and empty while dozens of children gathered outside, wondering where their breakfast had gone. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, who cleaned the church next door, was the first to notice something was wrong. She had arrived early to prepare for morning mass and expected to see warm light glowing from the convent windows. Instead, the building sat dark and still. When she knocked on the front door, no one answered. She tried the handle and found it unlocked, which was unusual. The nuns were careful about security, especially at night. Stepping inside, Mrs. Vasquez called out their names. Her voice echoed through empty hallways. She checked the kitchen, the chapel, and finally the bedrooms. Each bed was neatly made, but cold to the touch. Personal belongings remained in their proper places. Prayer books sat open on nightstands. But the four women who had made this place a home were nowhere to be found. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky while a crowd of confused villagers gathered outside the convent. Father Miguel Rodriguez arrived at the Saint Helena convent 3 hours after the police. As the regional supervisor for all convents in the area, he had driven through winding mountain roads as soon as he received the urgent phone call. What he found defied all logical explanation. For devoted women of God had vanished from a locked building in a village where strangers were noticed immediately. The police investigation began that same afternoon. Detective Carlos Santos, a tired man in his 50s, had worked missing person cases for over 20 years. He had seen people disappear for many reasons. Some ran away from debts or bad marriages. Others fell victim to accidents or crimes. But this case felt different from the moment he stepped inside the convent. Everything appeared normal at first glance. The nuns' rooms were tidy and organized. Their few personal items remained untouched. In Sister Margaret's room, her Bible lay open to Psalm 23. Sister Catherine's lesson plans for the coming week were spread across her small desk. Sister Ann's medical supplies were carefully arranged and labeled. Sister Rose's gardening gloves sat by her window, ready for spring planting. Detective Santos interviewed every person in the village. The questioning took 3 days because he spoke with each family multiple times, hoping someone might remember a small detail that could provide a clue. The results were frustrating. No one had seen the nuns leave the convent. No one had noticed strangers in the village. No one had heard unusual sounds during the night. Mrs. Martinez, who lived closest to the convent, swore she had seen candlelight in the chapel windows at 9 o'clock that Monday night. This matched the nuns' usual evening prayer schedule. But by midnight, when she let her dog outside one final time, the convent was completely dark. She assumed the sisters had gone to bed, as they always did. The investigation expanded beyond the village. Police checked hospitals, morgues, and bus stations throughout the region. They contacted other convents, thinking the nuns might have been transferred suddenly. They examined financial records, though the sisters owned almost nothing of value. Every lead reached a dead end. Detective Santos brought in search dogs to comb the hills around Saint Helena. The animals picked up familiar scents near the convent, but lost the trail within a few hundred yards. It was as if the four women had simply walked into the forest and been swallowed by the earth itself. Father Rodriguez worked closely with the investigation, providing information about the nuns' backgrounds and daily routines. He had known all four women for years and could not imagine any reason they would leave their calling. Sister Margaret had spoken excitedly about plans for expanding the children's program. Sister Catherine had recently requested more teaching supplies. Sister Anne was treating several villagers for ongoing medical conditions. Sister Rose had been preparing seedlings for the spring garden. As weeks passed without answers, the case began to attract attention from outside the valley. Newspaper reporters arrived to write stories about the mysterious disappearance. Religious leaders from the capital city came to pray and offer support. The bishop himself visited Saint Helena to reassure the community that everything possible was being done to find the missing sisters. But despite all the attention and effort, no trace of the four nuns was ever discovered. Detective Santos filed his final report 3 months later, officially classifying the case as an unsolved disappearance. The investigation remained open, but no new leads emerged. The file was stored in a cabinet at the regional police station, where it would gather dust for the next 3 decades. The village of Saint Helena struggled to return to normal life. The convent stood empty, its windows dark and doors locked. Parents had to find new ways to feed their children breakfast. Students lost their dedicated teacher. Sick villagers had nowhere to turn for medical help. The beautiful gardens that Sister Rose had tended so carefully grew wild and overgrown. Some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminder of their loss. Others stayed, but avoided looking directly at the abandoned convent. Children who had played in its gardens were forbidden from going near the building. Ghost stories began to circulate, though the older villagers tried to discourage such talk. Years passed, and the sharp pain of loss gradually dulled into a persistent ache. The story of the missing nuns became part of St. Helena's history, passed down to younger generations who had never known the 4 women personally. But the mystery remained unsolved, and the questions never stopped haunting those who remembered that terrible February morning when 4 lights were extinguished from their world without warning or explanation. By 1985, a new priest named Father Antonio had been assigned to serve the St. Helena parish. He was young and energetic, full of ideas for revitalizing the struggling community. The bishop had chosen him specifically because of his reputation for bringing hope to difficult situations. Father Antonio looked at the empty convent and saw potential rather than tragedy. The young priest began asking questions about the missing nuns, not as an investigator, but as someone who wanted to understand the history of his new home. Older villagers were reluctant to discuss the disappearance, but gradually they began sharing their memories. Father Antonio listened carefully to every story, taking mental notes about details that others might have forgotten. He spent hours in the abandoned convent, walking through rooms where the 4 sisters had lived and worked. The building had been maintained by the church, but it felt hollow and sad. Father Antonio could almost hear echoes of prayers and laughter that had once filled these spaces. He began to wonder if there might be clues that the original investigation had missed. The priest started organizing community activities to honor the memory of the missing nuns. He held memorial services on the anniversary of their disappearance. He encouraged villagers to share positive memories rather than dwelling on the mystery. Slowly, St. Helena began to heal from the trauma that had haunted it for nearly a decade. Father Antonio also began corresponding with other priests and religious communities throughout the region. He wanted to learn if similar disappearances had occurred elsewhere. Most of his letters received routine responses, but a few hinted at strange events that had never been officially reported. The priest sensed there might be connections that no one had previously considered. In 1988, Father Antonio received permission from the bishop to reopen the convent as a community center. Local families worked together to clean and repair the building. As they removed years of dust and neglect, workers occasionally found personal items that had belonged to the missing nuns. A hairpin under Sister Margaret's bed, a pressed flower in Sister Catherine's Bible, small reminders of lives that had been cut short. During the renovation, Father Antonio spent many evenings alone in the building, praying and thinking about the 4 women who had once called this place home. He felt a deep connection to their memory and a growing determination to find answers that had eluded everyone else. But he knew that solving a 10-year-old mystery would require patience, faith, and perhaps a miracle. The community center officially opened on Christmas Day 1988. Villagers gathered for a celebration that mixed joy with remembrance. Children played in rooms where Sister Rose had once prepared meals. Adults attended literacy classes in the space where Sister Catherine had taught. Father Antonio offered basic medical care where Sister and had once treated patients. The building lived again, though everyone understood it would never be quite the same. As the 1990s began, Father Antonio continued his quiet investigation into the disappearance. He had no official authority and limited resources, but he had something the original investigators had lacked: time and an intimate knowledge of the community. He began to notice patterns and connections that outsiders might miss. Small inconsistencies in old stories. Nervous reactions when certain topics were mentioned. The priest realized that someone in Saint Helena knew more than they had ever admitted. People would change the subject when he asked certain questions. Some villagers seemed uncomfortable when he mentioned specific details about the night the nuns disappeared. Father Antonio began to suspect that the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. But breaking through decades of silence would require more than persistence. It would require trust, patience, and the right moment when someone's conscience finally overcame their fear. Father Antonio continued his work in the community, building relationships and waiting for that moment to arrive. He had learned that some secrets take decades to reveal themselves. Father Antonio had been serving the St. Helena parish for nearly 15 years when he made his first real breakthrough in 2001. It came not from dramatic investigation work, but from simple human kindness. Mrs. Carmen Gutierrez, now in her 70s, had been avoiding confession for months. When she finally came to Father Antonio, her guilt was overwhelming. Mrs. Gutierrez had been the postmistress in 1978, responsible for all mail coming in and out of St. Helena. She had never told investigators about a series of strange letters that had arrived at the convent in the weeks before the nuns disappeared. The letters bore no return address and were written in handwriting she did not recognize. At the time, she had assumed they were routine correspondence from church officials, but something about those letters had bothered her for over 20 years. They had felt different somehow, heavier, more urgent. Mrs. Gutierrez remembered how Sister Margaret's face had changed after reading the first one. The usually cheerful nun had become quiet and worried, though she had not explained why to anyone in the village. Father Antonio listened carefully as the elderly woman described her memories. She recalled at least 3 letters arriving during January 1978, always addressed to Sister Margaret personally. After the nuns disappeared, Mrs. Gutierrez had searched her records but found no copies of the letters. They had vanished along with the 4 women. This revelation energized Father Antonio's investigation. He began researching the postal system as it had existed in 1978, trying to trace how unaddressed mail might have reached St. Helena. He contacted retired postal workers and examined old delivery routes. The work was tedious, but it provided the first tangible lead the case had seen in decades. Through patient detective work, Father Antonio discovered that mail without return addresses often originated from a monastery located about 100 miles north of St. Helena. The monastery of San Cristobal was a secretive community of monks who rarely interacted with the outside world. Most people in the region knew little about their activities or beliefs. Father Antonio decided to visit San Cristobal in the spring of 2002. The journey took most of a day by car along winding mountain roads. When he finally reached the monastery, he found a massive stone complex surrounded by high walls. The buildings looked ancient and forbidding, nothing like the welcoming atmosphere of most religious communities. Brother Thomas, the monastery's guest master, greeted Father Antonio politely, but with obvious suspicion. The monks were not accustomed to unexpected visitors, especially ones asking questions about events from decades past. Brother Thomas listened to Father Antonio's inquiries about the missing nuns, but claimed to know nothing about any correspondence with the Saint Helena convent. However, Father Antonio noticed something interesting during his brief visit. In the monastery's main chapel, he saw a stained glass window depicting 4 female saints. The faces in the window bore a striking resemblance to descriptions of the missing nuns. When he asked Brother Thomas about the window, the monk became nervous and ended their conversation abruptly. The priest left San Cristobal with more questions than answers, but he felt certain he was on the right track. Something about the monastery did not feel right. The monks seemed to be hiding secrets, and their reaction to his questions about the nuns had been telling. Father Antonio began planning a more thorough investigation of the mysterious religious community. Back in Saint Helena, Father Antonio continued gathering information about San Cristobal Monastery. He discovered that the community had been founded in the 1960s by a charismatic leader named Brother Marcus, who claimed to have received special visions from God. The monastery followed unusual practices that some church officials found concerning, though no formal complaints had ever been filed. The priest also learned that San Cristobal had connections to several other religious communities throughout Latin America. These connections formed a network of monasteries and convents that maintained contact through letters and occasional visits. Some of these communities had also experienced unexplained disappearances over the years, though the incidents had never been linked together. Father Antonio spent months writing letters to priests and bishops throughout the region, asking about missing religious personnel and unusual activities at isolated religious communities. The responses painted a disturbing picture of a shadow network operating within the official church structure. Several communities reported sisters or brothers who had disappeared without explanation, always after receiving mysterious letters. The pattern was becoming clear. As 2003 began, Father Antonio felt he was closing in on the truth about what had happened to the 4 nuns from Saint Helena. But he also realized he was dealing with something much larger and more dangerous than a simple disappearance. The network of religious communities connected to San Cristobal appeared to be involved in activities that violated church law and possibly civil law as well. The priest knew he needed help to pursue his investigation further. He contacted the regional bishop, Father Rodriguez, who had supervised the original search for the missing nuns. Father Rodriguez was now an old man, but his memory of the case remained sharp. He listened carefully to Father Antonio's findings and agreed that something sinister might have been hidden for decades. Together, the 2 priests began planning a formal investigation that would involve church authorities and possibly civil police. They knew they were taking significant risks by challenging a powerful network that had operated in secret for so many years. But they also knew they owed it to the memory of Sister Margaret, Sister Catherine, Sister Anne, and Sister Rose to finally uncover the truth about their fate. The breakthrough Father Antonio had been seeking came in late 2003, but not from his official investigation. Instead, it came from an unexpected source, a dying monk at San Cristobal Monastery who could no longer live with the weight of his secrets. Brother Francis had been at the monastery since 1975 and had witnessed events that haunted him for nearly 30 years. Brother Francis contacted Father Antonio through an intermediary, requesting a secret meeting away from San Cristobal. The elderly monk was suffering from advanced cancer and knew he had only weeks left to live. His conscience demanded that he reveal the truth before facing God's judgment. The meeting was arranged for a small church halfway between Saint Helena and San Cristobal. When Father Antonio met Brother Francis, He found a frail man whose eyes held decades of guilt and fear. The dying monk spoke in whispers, constantly looking around as if expecting to be discovered. What he revealed over the next 2 hours would finally solve the mystery of the missing nuns, but the truth was more horrific than anyone had imagined. Brother Francis explained that San Cristobal Monastery was not the peaceful religious community it appeared to be. Instead, it was the center of a cult that had infiltrated legitimate religious orders throughout the region. The cult's leader, Brother Marcus, claimed to receive divine revelations that justified activities the mainstream church would never approve. According to Brother Francis, the cult believed that certain religious people possessed special spiritual energy that could be harvested through ritual sacrifice. They identified potential victims by observing their dedication and the love they inspired in their communities. The 4 nuns from Saint Helena had been perfect targets because of their reputation for holiness and service. The letters that Mrs. Gutierrez remembered had been invitations for the nuns to attend a special religious conference at San Cristobal. The letters had been carefully crafted to appear official and important, mentioning opportunities for advanced spiritual training that would benefit their work in Saint Helena. Sister Margaret had been excited about the invitation and had convinced her 3 companions to accept. On the night of February 13th, 1978, the 4 nuns had left their convent voluntarily, believing they were traveling to a religious retreat. They had been instructed to tell no one about their destination, as the conference was supposedly secret and exclusive. A van from San Cristobal had picked them up at midnight, and they had driven away willingly, full of anticipation for spiritual growth. But instead of attending a conference, the 4 women had been taken to a remote location in the mountains where the cult conducted its rituals. Brother Francis could not bring himself to describe exactly what had happened to them, but he made it clear that Sister Margaret, Sister Catherine, Sister Anne, and Sister Rose had been murdered in ceremonies that the cult believed would transfer their spiritual power to Brother Marcus and his followers. Father Antonio listened in horrified silence as Brother Francis revealed the locations where the nuns' bodies had been buried. The cult had scattered their remains across multiple sites to prevent discovery, believing this would make their spiritual energy more powerful. The dying monk also revealed that the 4 nuns from St. Helena were not the cult's only victims. Over the years, dozens of religious men and women had disappeared after receiving similar invitations. The cult had operated for decades, carefully selecting targets from isolated communities where their absence might not trigger major investigations. They had perfected their methods of luring victims and disposing of evidence. Brother Francis gave Father Antonio detailed maps showing the burial locations and a list of names of other cult members who had participated in the murders. He also provided documents proving that Brother Marcus had forged official church correspondence to make his invitations appear legitimate. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. As their secret meeting ended, Brother Francis begged Father Antonio to ensure that the victims received proper Christian burial and that the cult members faced justice for their crimes. The dying monk knew he was condemning himself by revealing these secrets, but he could not face death without trying to make amends for his decades of silence and complicity. Father Antonio left the meeting with his faith shaken, but his determination strengthened. He finally knew what had happened to the 4 beloved nuns, but the knowledge brought pain rather than comfort. The truth was worse than any theory the villagers of St. Helena had imagined during their 30 years of wondering and grief. Armed with Brother Francis's revelations and evidence, Father Antonio contacted both church authorities and civil police. The case was reopened as a homicide investigation, with teams of detectives and forensic experts assigned to verify the dying monk's claims. The investigation would take months to complete, but Father Antonio felt certain that justice would finally be served. The first excavations began in early 2004, using Brother Francis's maps to locate burial sites scattered throughout the mountain region. Forensic teams worked carefully to recover human remains while preserving evidence that might support criminal prosecutions. The work was difficult and emotionally draining, but it gradually confirmed the dying monk's testimony. In a shallow grave behind San Cristobal Monastery, investigators found bones that DNA testing proved belonged to Sister Margaret. Her remains were mixed with those of several other victims, suggesting the cult had used mass burial sites for their ritualistic murders. Further excavations revealed similar graves containing the remains of Sister Catherine, Sister Anne, and Sister Rose. The discoveries made international headlines as the scope of the cult's activities became clear. Police raids on San Cristobal and related properties uncovered documents detailing decades of murders disguised as religious activities. Brother Marcus had died in 1995, but several of his followers were still alive and were arrested on multiple charges of murder and conspiracy. Father Antonio worked closely with investigators to ensure that all victims received proper identification and burial. The remains of the 4 nuns from Saint Helena were returned to their village, where the entire community gathered for funeral masses that had been delayed for over 25 years. The services mixed celebration of their lives with mourning for their terrible fate. The legal proceedings against surviving cult members continued for several years, with multiple convictions for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The trials revealed additional details about the cult's beliefs and methods, helping authorities understand how such evil had operated within religious communities for so long without detection. Father Antonio used the resolution of the case as an opportunity to strengthen protections for isolated religious communities. He worked with church officials to establish better communication systems and verification procedures that would prevent similar deceptions in the future. His efforts helped ensure that the deaths of Sister Margaret, Sister Catherine, Sister Anne, and Sister Rose would contribute to preventing future tragedies. The village of Saint Helena finally had closure after 3 decades of uncertainty and grief. The community center that had been created in the former convent was officially rededicated as a memorial to the 4 murdered nuns. Their story became a reminder of both the dangers that can hide within seemingly holy places and the importance of never giving up the search for truth and justice. Father Antonio continued serving the St. Helena parish until his retirement, always carrying the knowledge that his persistence and faith had finally brought peace to a community that had suffered in silence for far too long. The case of the missing nuns had taught him that even the darkest secrets cannot remain hidden forever when dedicated people refuse to stop seeking the truth.